going on, everybody? It's RoarWise coming at you with a brand new video, and Euros have finally concluded, meaning that all of our national season, I believe, is finally finished, which I did incorrectly state was the case back in, July. Sorry about that, guys. I'm still not, super up there in the larger scale events, dates and things like that, especially with all the different movements we've had. I don't think we've ever had a national season this late. But with that being said, that means that we're finally in a situation where it's mainly just regionals and YCSs as our main events, and so things are sort of cooling down a little bit, despite the release of Power of the Elements last month in August, which has actually shaped the format a lot compared to what it was beforehand. And so because it is that time of the month again, I will be bringing you guys a brand new tier list. But before we actually do this tier list, I do want to showcase exactly what each of the tiers mean, because it seems like for the last few months, some people in my comments have seemed to not quite actually understand exactly what each tier means, and a lot of people are just like, oh, this deck won the event, therefore it's a tier 1 deck, when that's completely not the case. And so let's just go over real quick exactly what each of these tiers mean. So tier 1 are basically the undisputed best decks of the format. They're the ones that usually have the highest representation, the highest win rate and success rate, with the best turnover compared to the other decks, and are basically just the most consistent with their statistics compared to some of the other decks that do well. The tier 1.5 decks are the decks that borderline on either the strength or the consistency or the representation of the tier 1 decks, but they just cut shy of that in one of those many categories. But they are very strong decks that typically keep the tier 1 decks in check and prevent them from being too powerful. Tier 2 decks are the decks that see a decent chunk of representation. They have a dedicated fan base to them of players, and they're actually quite strong. They're either really consistent, they're really powerful for their end board, they're one of the many different aspects, but they usually lack in either representation or actual power itself, and they typically require a pretty good pilot to actually use effectively, but you will see them here and there in top cuts, or sometimes even winning an event. And finally, rogue decks are the ones that are strong in a sense, but don't really see either too much representation and even less so actual success at events. They require an immensely talented pilot with a good knowledge of the deck, usually, to actually see any sort of success with the deck. And for example, it's something like ABC or Paleo Frog back in Eternal format, where you'd see it take a top cut at a YCS or something here and there, or maybe even a regional win if they were lucky, but it's not really something that you're going to be seeing all over the place like the other three categories. I will be trying to base this off of both regional statistics and off of these statistics we've gotten from Euros. I do not believe that there is any information up for YCS Niagara, given that it's not concluded as of recording this video, so please keep that in mind, that if something does suddenly change, which I don't think it will, but if something does suddenly sweep over YCS Niagara and we see tier 0 Ojama or something like that, you know, I don't think that's going to happen, but if something does happen like that, just keep in mind that I'm not going to be up to date with that. I do have to record this a little bit in advance, unfortunately, due to all the other projects that I have coming up for the month of September. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list for the September 2022 format. So the first deck that I'm going to be looking at on this tier list is going to be Rika / Plant Link / Sun Avalon / whatever the fuck you want to call it. And Rika did actually take the majority of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan base by surprise by winning the European National Championship. Despite this incredible feat, however, I am going to have to relegate it to the tier 2 category. Plant Link does have a dedicated player base to it, however, it doesn't really see too much success. It was seeing a regional top here and there, and sometimes a win. However, I don't believe it actually has seen too much play in the very high events. I think it did some decent stuff at a Chalice Slime Monthly a little bit ago. However, in Power of the Elements, they did get new support in the form of cards like Rika Con, which is their field spell, which is a very strong card, and then a few other things. I believe Rika Princess as well is one of their new cards, a free summon from hand, but it locks you into plants, which is whatever, you're locked into plants regardless. I am going to keep it in the tier 2 category because not only do we not have a superb amount of information on it yet, there's still only a small chunk of representation as opposed to a bunch of representation, at least for now. Especially because people are going to be hyping it now. We probably will see a little bit more representation to it, but I do think the deck is rather strong. Again, Rika Con being able to allow you to break boards without actually activating any effects, so you just do it for cost, and its end board isn't all too shabby, especially because it is all off of one card. I believe they can do more if they get a little bit of more extension, as well as playing through hand traps, of course, if they do have that extension. But we do have to remember that I know Cali Effect has been saying stuff like, oh, you know, people don't read cards anyway, it's not about the fact that they didn't read the cards, but That is a big thing. People, like, reading the cards is one thing, but understanding what they do and how they work with the rest of the deck is a complete other thing. Remember when Altergeist won that one YCS out of the blue, and then everyone was like, oh my god, this deck is amazing, it's going to do so much. And then, like, the next YCS, was it like YCS Sydney or something like that? Maybe that was the one that it won, I don't remember. But the next YCS, there was literally nothing. No Altergeist players made it to top 32. I don't even think they made it to top 64, despite the representation, because as soon as people catch on how a deck plays and exactly what it does, especially with content creators actually pumping out videos that allow you to understand what the deck does, then the deck is just going to have a lot harder of a time. Most people don't understand how Plant Link works, especially after Power of the Elements with all of the new cards, except for the actual dedicated players, and so they are going to be snagging a lot more wins than they usually should be, but I will be keeping it in tier 2 because I don't want to downplay the deck as a whole. So next up we have Mech. So I'm very sorry that in my last tier list I didn't have Mech. It wasn't something that was really on my radar, especially because a lot of people weren't talking about it. It wasn't one of those decks that like everyone suddenly knew was going to be meta, like Sprite and Tier and all that stuff, but shockingly this deck has been doing really well. So Mech is one of the big, I guess 5 Cyberse archetypes right now, being itself, Salad, Marincess, Adignister, and Code Talker. And I would like to argue that it is the best out of those 5. It has a large variety of 1 and 1.5 card combos. I think they have some 2 card combos that are even stronger as well. They have a bunch of different things that they can do on their end board. They can go into Heat Soul. They get basically Tri-Brigade Revolt, but for Laplacian, which I believe is 2 interruptions on its own. It looks like a Hand Rip, a Field Send. I think it also hits like one other thing. It can play a bunch of hand traps and board breakers. It can make access codes swing multiple times and make it like super huge. Not to mention their built-in boss monster, Geomathmech Final Sigma, which I am using as the card artwork here, is a very strong card overall. I believe it can do double damage. Yeah, it can't swing twice, I don't think, but it can do double damage, but you can swing twice if you use some of their other cards that allow it to do so. It's a Towers, meaning it's completely unaffected by anything your opponent might have to stop it, and it just has really good going first and second plays. Therefore, I'm actually going to be putting it at the bottom of the 1.5 category. So I'm sure the statistic is balanced out a little bit by now, but keep in mind, within the first few weeks of regionals, I believe the first 2 or 3 weekends of regionals since we got back, Mech had the 3rd most tops out of any deck, only behind Sprite and Tearlament. Think about that. I think the deck is overall really neat, and again, I do want to apologize for not having it in the last tier list because there was just no statistics on it, but I can comfortably put the deck in tier 1.5, as I think it's going to do great things in the future. Next up, we have Sprite, and you probably already know that this is going in the tier 1 category. I did put it as my best deck in my top 5 meta decks for the August 2022 format, which you should totally go check out if you haven't already. It will be in the top right corner in the annotations. But Sprite is just kind of uncontested for the tier 1 deck right now, at least in this current format is what I should be saying. It's basically a given with how consistent the deck is in both its actual win rate and its gameplay, because it has a bunch of 1 to 2 card combos or even 1.5 card combos. It has really good follow-up and recursion, but one thing I will say is that the deck does struggle a little bit for the board breaking and the OTK aspect of things, especially the latter, and so it's usually going to be going into Zeus going second to try and just get the board completely clean and start its own combo back up or up in the first place if it went second or if it's turn 3. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm rambling, by the way. It's like 11 o'clock at night, and I usually don't record these things so late, but we had people over, so yeah, there's also just so many different ways that you can play Sprite. There's so many different variants. You got the regular build, which I guess it's pure as people call it, but it has the frog package in it, so I'd call it Frog Sprite. We have Sprite Brigade, which is the Tri-Brigade engine mixed in along with it. We have Live Twin Sprite, which it did actually top Euros. It got top 4, but it was a bit of a weird list to me, but I mean, I can't really downplay it. I guess it did get top 4. You got Melfi Sprite. You can probably play Ojama Sprite, I guess. Like, there's just so many different ways you can actually play the Sprite strategy. It's insane, and most of these, keep in mind, when I'm talking about the Sprite variants here, I'm not talking about that engine using a smaller Sprite engine to facilitate its plays. I'm talking about the Sprite using the other engine to facilitate these Sprite plays. For example, that Live Twin Sprite list that I am mentioning is something that I'd consider to be using the Live Twin cards to facilitate the Sprite things without using the Sprite things to facilitate the Live Twin things, as I would put in a deck like Live Twin down here, which we will get to. But yeah, with all that out of the way, Sprite is basically in an uncontested tier 1 right now, or at least until another deck comes and overpowers it. Speaking of which, we are going to talk about Tearlament. I guess just due to the sheer amount of representation, I will be putting tier limit at the bottom of the tier 1 category. It is kind of iffy for me still to put it there. I would still like to put it in 1.5 based on the actual strength, but I can't really contest all of the people that are just playing it. There are so many people on tier. It's usually almost tied with Sprite, if not overtaking it for representation, and it does see a bunch of success in Top Cut. I haven't been informed if it's won any of the regionals that have been around. Please let me know if that is the case, especially after this video goes up, because I can't find the information for all of it. I usually have to rely on another content creator like MCole to find that statistics. But Tier just is seeing a lot of gameplay right now. Overall, I would say Sprite is the better deck, but Tier has a bunch of things going for it in that, again, it's another deck that you can play a bunch of variants of. You have the branded package that you can throw in there to do some branded shenanigans, but it will lock you in only fusions, which makes something like Dimensional Barrier hurt, but it is very recursive and very consistent. You have the Danger build, which is a bit more RNG heavy, but it is really good at pumping out free bodies on the board, triggering all of your tier limit plays, getting additional effects for board breaking such as Bigfoot, as well as being able to let you go into Link monsters, which lets you not only use your fusion stuff, but also go into things like IP Masquerena, Appaloosa, and things like that. It also puts super rare Mothmans up to like $15. I think once Darkwing Blast comes out in late October, and especially when we get Magnificent Mavens in November, the deck is probably going to overtake Sprite in the tier 1 category and be the best deck. However, I will say that for now, it is just going to be under Sprite, because there are a lot of things such as D-Shifter and Dimensional Barrier that can counter it, and despite the representation, I don't think it is the most crazy deck that you could be playing right now. Speaking of not being the most crazy deck you can play right now, I have branded Despia. I'll be nice and put it above Mech in the tier 1.5 category, but this deck has certainly fallen off compared to what it used to be. It was at one point not uncontested for, but basically taking up the top slot in the tier 1 category. However, it is a little bit lackluster right now, as we have entered a much faster format, and so Mirror Jade on its own and like branded in red, maybe with a Masquerade, isn't going to cut it anymore. There's a bunch of people playing a Dimensional Barrier even more in the side deck than they were before, meaning that you are going to have a lot of issues actually resolving your fusion summoning, and without it, the deck can't really do too much else. The main deck boss monsters aren't really going to be hitting the board too often. And again, it is a lot slower than some of the other decks that you could be playing, like Sprite or Tier, or even something like Mech or Plant Link. And so I'm going to be putting it in the tier 1.5 category, I believe, like I did last list, until it somehow climbs up there again. Maybe if we get some new branded stuff other than the Bisted stuff coming out. I don't even know when they're going to stop that lore, but as long as it gives me more Tri-Brigade cards, I do not care. Speaking of the Albaz lore, we have Sword Soul, and I really want to put Sword Soul in tier 1, I really do. I do think it has the strength to do so, but I'm going to be putting it at the top of 1.5 for now. And I know Sword Soul hasn't been seeing too much representation, mainly because of new toy syndrome currently, and it hasn't been seeing a bunch of tops compared to as it did in like the national season for the United States, but there are a bunch of different factors going into this that we have to think about. So again, we are under a current state of new toy syndrome. We got things like Sprite and Tier and Mech and Plant Link and all these other things that people are wanting to play, which, by the way, does speak about how much representation you can have in this format with a different deck. Like, just look at the amount of decks that I have on here that you can technically play right now. It's crazy. There's so much variety in this format. I really like it. But with new toy syndrome, people are going to be basically playing off that scene in Toy Story where Andy throws Woody away, this time with Sword Soul saying, "I don't want to play with you anymore." And that is a big factor when it comes to being a tier 1 deck. I do think it has the strength to be a tier 1 deck. Nothing has changed for the deck. If anything, it just gets stronger with more things like Desires going back to 2. If anything, the deck just gets stronger with all the different ways people are still innovating it. But if there's not the representation in the overall, like players, then there's going to be even less representation in the top cut, and overall just less representation as a whole as a deck. And so people aren't going to be, you know, pumping out free wins with it anymore. You know, if it's not seeing a bunch of representation as a whole at an event, it's going to see even less representation in top cut, and with people seeing less representation in top cut, there's going to be less people wanting to play it because it doesn't seem like it's doing too well, and it's just going to be a perpetual cycle until people are no longer afflicted with the new toy syndrome. Not to mention that we are in a bit more of a board breaker heavy format because it is a faster format with a bunch of comboing going on, and board breakers are the bane of Sword Soul's existence because instead of being able to play through hand traps, they have to sit there and take the Dark Ruler directly to the face for their 2 to 3 synchro end board, which is very painful to say the least. However, it can play around that a little bit with things like Sword Soul Blackout, and the follow-up that the deck has is nothing too shabby. And one of the things that Sword Soul has that a lot of the other decks this format doesn't have is the ability to go second. Things like Tenyi Spirit Vashuda make the deck really easily able to break boards, and they have the native access to things like Dark Ruler like a lot of other decks can, as well as access to really powerful level 10 board breaking synchros such as Baronet of Fleur and their own archetypal Chengying. I don't think the deck has been weakened by any means. In fact, I think it's just at the same exact pace as it was before, but people are just playing a bunch of different decks right now and playing counters to those decks, which makes it weaker a little bit in terms of the player base rather than the deck itself. And so until we go back to maybe a more hand trap oriented format, or we see some more hits on the current top decks, Sword Soul is going to be in the tier 1.5 category. Next up we have Predaplant, and I want to put it at the bottom of tier 2. Yeah, I think top of Rogue is kind of like underestimating it a bit. I want to put Branded Predaplant at the bottom of tier 2. I think the deck is actually really good and really slept on. Things like Instant Fusion are just a one-card full combo into a bunch of different things on your end board. You can search things like Super Poly and Fusion Destiny, both of which are great cards right now for going first or going second, and it has a lot of interactions off of 1 and 1.5 cards. The main reason that this deck isn't seeing as much success is not only just due to a lack of representation, but also things like Dimensional Barrier are very strong against it, and there are certain hands that are a bit lackluster, especially if you are playing the DPE engine. You can have a little bit of bricks here and there, and then Darlingtonia Cobra, let's not even talk about that. But I do think the deck is pretty strong in both going first and going second. But other than that, I don't think I have much to say about the deck due to the lack of representation, but I think you should totally look into it if you're looking for a way to use your branded package without spending a liver on Tearlament. Next up, we have Invoked Variants, and I'm going to put Invoked Variants, I want to put them above the Predaplant stuff, mainly because it's a lot more consistent than a Predaplant stuff, with their hands being a little less clunky. I think Alistair is going to be normal summoned until the day that the game itself implodes. I think it's a really good way to buffer yourself against hand traps, because either they have to hit the Alistair or get their hand traps hit by the Mechaba. There's a lot of benefits to playing invoked packages with especially with your branded stuff. You know, you can play Despia things, DPE. You can even actually play invoked stuff in Tearlament. It is one of the many variants of Tearlament. But overall, the end boards just aren't too crazy, even with things like Winda. And so unless Nadir comes to like 3 and a sudden surprise like ban list removal, which again, that was still such a stupid hit, I don't think Invoked is going to be doing anything too crazy for right now. Next up, we have Adignister. Do I want to put it at the bottom of tier 2 or the top of Rogue? This is a hard question, actually. I think I want to be generous and put it at the bottom of tier 2 for now. So Adignister is kind of thriving in a format like this because, again, we are in a much more board breaker focused format as opposed to a hand trap format, and with their end board being a very large towers, a lot of decks actually can't deal with that without stopping it from being summoned in the first place. Decks like Sprite are actually completely unable to even out the rival Cybers Adignister because they rely on using things like Zeus to break boards, but Zeus doesn't really do anything to the rival Cybers. I think the deck is still very fragile for the decks that do play hand traps, or at least the few hand traps that certain decks do play, especially things like Infinite Impermanence on their Dark Templar. But I think the deck is overall fine, especially when it does make its towers monster, because again, a lot of decks have some issues outing it, and it has been seeing a bit more success now than it has been lately, and so I'll be generous and put it at the bottom of the tier 2 category for now. Next up, we have Altergeist, and this deck did get top 4 at Euros. It did amazing, you know, we saw a lot of success with it, and that's why I'm going to put it in the Rogue category. You guys seriously didn't think I'm going to be putting Altergeist outside of that, right? Like, we understand that that was Mystic Mine and not Altergeist, right? You can't expect a deck playing 3 Mystic Mine, 3 Demise of the Land, 1 Terraforming, 1 Metaverse to be anything more than Rogue, because let's be real, that's the only reason that the deck actually did well. Activating Mystic Mine, normal summoning Malusik, and then poking repeatedly for time or even for game is just not very good gameplay, and it all dies to a singular Cosmic Cyclone. I don't care how good B-Cop was against Harpies, this deck sucks. Anyways, moving on. Speaking of a deck that sucks, I'm gonna be putting Dinosaur at the top of Rogue. As per usual, without 3 Misk, it's even clunkier than it was before, and it has a lot less follow-up. And out of all the hand traps people aren't playing, Ash is not one of them, and because Ash is just so good against the deck, yeah, there's really not much reason to put it above the Rogue category. It does steal, like, tops here and there, but it doesn't really do anything too crazy overall. Honestly, it just serves as a really good board-breaking deck in a board-breaking format. I mean, hey, at least people aren't playing Lancier right now, so there's that. Next up, we have Tron, and I want to be nice and put Tron at the top of tier 2. Tron is still an incredible deck. We do still have 2 Ben 10 after the last Forbidden and Limited list. We're honestly looking at getting 3 probably on the next list, just like Tenki, and there's not too much I can say about the deck that hasn't already been said before. Overall, it's really consistent, especially with the Ben 10 stuff. It has amazing follow-up and recursion. Its main weaknesses are decks like Flunder or anything that can play Dimension Shifter, because Dimension Shifter completely shits all over it. But it's essentially a deck where, because you're not playing too many hand traps, you know, it's basically draw the out for my Vanity's Ruler or perish. Oh yeah, and that Dark Ruler you had? Well, unfortunately, I summoned Magic-E Musket Bato Buster, and now I have a counter trap that can counter any out that you may have for my Vanity's Ruler, and potentially screw over your specific deck by locking you into a certain attribute. We're probably going to be seeing even more Tron representation after the 2022 Megatins, because it is highly likely that we will be seeing reprints of Tron Mubeta Fafnir and Diviner of the Herald, which are both really good and slightly pricey cards for the deck, that while not mandatory in terms of Diviner, you could just play Manju instead. The deck has a lot better synergy with the Diviner stuff, and overall does a lot better, and so we're probably going to be seeing a lot of Tron on our horoscope. Next up, we have Eldritch, and I still want to put Eldritch just above, actually I'm going to put it below Math Mech in 1.5. I think Eldritch hasn't been doing too hot lately as it has been the last few formats. A lot of people are on main deck back row removal, essentially meaning that your trap cards aren't as strong, but it does have a lot of recursion, and Solemn Judgment is a card, and so Eldritch is still doing just fine. Again, you can splash it with a lot of things like Branded, and honestly, you can probably play some sort of random Sprite variant, which sounds a bit weird, trust me, I know, but it can probably be played. I mean, we just saw Sprite Runic as a thing. You probably put Sprite in anything. So yeah, I don't think Eldritch is doing anything like too bad right now. While it's not doing amazing, I do still think it's a very strong deck and deserving of the tier 1.5 category. Another deck deserving of the tier 1.5 category is going to be Flunder, and I'm tempted to put Flunder above Sword Soul. So Flunder's been seeing more representation both as a whole and in top cuts lately. It was the only deck other than Sprite to win in the first set of regionals, which I know has been a little bit, but that is a credit under its belt. It has a bunch of cards that counter the meta right now. You have things like Harpy's Featherstorm, which shuts off everything. You have things like the Barrier Statue, which shuts off most things. You have, of course, Dimensional Shifter, which shuts off, like, 90% of decks right now. I hate that card so much. And with less and less hand traps being in the format, the deck just does so much better now than it ever has before, because it doesn't have to worry about dodging them too much. And until we see these ridiculous power cards hit on a Forbidden and Limited list, which might not actually be until December like they were saying, then I don't think Flunder is going to be moving from this category for a while. Next up, we have Exo Sister, and I'm glad we can all come to the conclusion that Exo Sister is an incredibly mid deck. And before everyone in my comments starts flaming me, but have you read Garura? Seriously, have you read this card? Exo Sister gets bodied by this card. With everyone and their grandmother able to run Super Poly in their side or even in their main in a deck like Tier, this deck is not in a hot spot right now because Garura is just everywhere. And while I know one card isn't usually means to dictate a deck's actual relevance, ask Euros how that went. It will be seeing, you know, a top or two here and there, but compared to the OCG, I don't think Exo Sister is going to be doing like anything crazy, especially without something like Max C to facilitate more draws. While Martha is a really good card for the deck, it isn't enough to actually let it keep up. And the graveyard like control gimmick seems really cool. It seems like a good anti-meta strategy, but we have too many decks able to compete right now. If we are in a more tight, restricted format, either like an Eternals format sort of thing where we only have like 4 super viable decks, or even a tier 0 format where the best one does rely on the graveyard a lot, maybe then it'll see a lot more success, but the gimmick is just too specific in such a variety-filled format for me to put it any higher than Rogue. Next up, we have Tri-Brigade variants, and in order to be fair with the tier list, it does hurt my heart to say it, but I'll put Tri-Brigade above Exo Sister because it doesn't die to Super Poly. This is the first time I put it in Rogue ever, but it's mainly just the representation that's kind of killing me right now. It hasn't been seeing too many top cut reps. I think it maybe saw 1 in the last few regionals, which is a bit sad, but there are a lot of really cool ways to play the Tri-Brigade strategy. You have the Scareclaw Tri-Brigade variant that just finally got a bunch of new stuff in Power of the Elements, which I will be showcasing about 2 days after the release of this video. So you should totally check that out if it's out by the time you're seeing this. It does feature our good friend M Rocket on the channel again. and it's really cool. You should definitely look at it. But there are so many different ways to play Tri-Brigade. I also personally have a bird up list, which I'll probably try to link up in the annotations, but I've been linking it everywhere. It is one that I went basically undefeated with at a case tourney, and I do have a combo tutorial up for it as well. There actually has been a lot of representation, you know, at least online, by the way, not like actually in big tournament success, but there's been a lot of representation of a branded package being run of Albion branded sword and the Tri-Brigade Mercurier with a Muddy Mud Dragon in the extra deck, allowing you to use Mirror Jade, which I think is really cool because it basically gives you an upstart in the form of the Albion. You get a recurable monster negate, you get the Mirror Jade, which is a dump that special summons a Tri-Brigade from your deck at the end of the turn, and I think it's just something really fun. And even if you're not playing any of these wacky variants and you just want to play a more pure strategy, you can actually still use things like Gigantic Sprite and Sprite Elf to use the deck. Even if you don't want to go under the lock of Gigantic Sprite to summon your kit and your Karis for free from deck, you can still at least use Sprite Elf, which gives you basically no sort of restrictions, and just recur your Tri-Brigades from graveyard after you've either already used their effects and want to put them in grave to summon the other one, or as just basic extension at the end of your combo. I think the deck is only going to get better after the next ban list when we see Tenki inevitably come to 3. However, unless we see something big like a Recital Starling to 2 or even a Zodiac card come off, I don't think Tri-Brigade is going to be doing anything too crazy. Next up, we have Punk variants, and I'm going to be putting this between Tier and Sprite as the third deck in our Tier 1 category. I don't really have too much to say about these decks other than that they're just really good. E-Telly is just a really strong one-card combo that can net you almost any sort of floodgate that you feel like, whether it be Artifact Scythe or even Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity. The Therian cards are really good at protecting your stuff. The Adventurer cards are even better at protecting your stuff. And it's just full of a bunch of really consistent and good 1 to 2 card combos. And I really just won't be ranting about it too much. It's just doing really well right now, and it's really good. And they said the Adventure and Punk stuff would die after Power of the Elements. Pfft. Next up, we have Virtual World, and I guess I'll put it at the bottom of Tier 2. I want to be nice to Virtual World players, and, you know, with multiple Desires and 3 E-Telly, things like that, the deck is in a really good spot, and Shen Shen is pretty strong against decks like Sprite. But overall, it's still really clunky, a bit too clunky for me to put it any higher than the bottom of Tier 2. I don't think we've gotten anything in a while that, like, directly supports the deck, or even indirectly supports the deck. I don't think there's anything too crazy for it. I don't really want to, like, linger on it too long, because there's not really much to say. It's just not really doing as much as it used to by a landslide. I'm really hoping for some new support for it, though. I do want to see them get 1 or 2 more cards that actually help it. Maybe a new, like, gate spell, because Qinglong is still the only one. But until then, yeah, it's going to be at the bottom of Tier 2 for now. Next up, we have Dino Morphia, and this is actually a personal favorite deck of mine, but have you read Super Poly? I can't really bring it in my heart to put this any higher than Rogue. I think Rexsturm is a very powerful card, but with every deck either running the Adventure engine or the Super Poly engine, it's just way too bad to even put it above Rogue. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot less hand traps running around, meaning that you don't really have to worry as much about your Frenzy or Domain resolving, but it doesn't matter if they're just gonna hit you with a board breaker, you know? Next up, we have Rocket Dragon Link, and I guess for the sake of making the tier list look a bit prettier, Nah, I'm gonna have to put it in the 1.5 category, guys. I really don't want to put it any higher than this. It hasn't been seeing as much of representation as we've been expecting, at least in Top Cut. I think the deck is still perfectly fine. If you want to play it, go right ahead. But it is a bit susceptible to Super Poly when they end off on, like, Boral End and Abyss. And I think it utilizes the Adventure engine, like, a little bit worse than a deck like Punk does, because they can actually utilize the Griffin Rider for more stuff. And they have a lot more one-card combos that can get them places rather than having to rely on multiple things. So yeah, I'll just keep it in 1.5 for now. Feel free to yell at me in the comments, Dragon Link players, but I mean, whatever. Next up, speaking of another community that's probably going to yell at me, Salad still isn't that great, guys. I'll put it above Tri-Brigade. I think it's doing a bit better than Tri-Brigade, but I just don't think it's doing anything too crazy. If you want to build like Cyber's deck that can like end off on Heat Soul, build Math Mech or Adignister. If you want to make a really big like access code that can attack multiple times, just build Math Mech or Adignister. I don't know, it just feels a bit weak compared to some of the other Cyber's decks right now. And in terms of representation and in Top Cut, it's just not doing too great. Next up, we have Sky Striker, and I mean, I guess because Mystic Mine is still around, I'll put it under Rika. Like, it can use Mystic Mine really well. That's what Altergeist did, and it is a pretty recursive deck, and, you know, less hand traps, you know, you're not going to get your stuff hit as much. But, you know, Harpy's Feather Duster is a card. A lot of people are on main deck back row hate, and they're just not going to be in for a great time unless they can protect that Mystic Mine. Next up, we have Marincess, and whew, as someone who got clapped up in yesterday's tournament while playing Marincess, yikes, yeah, I'm going to have to put this... I'll be nice, actually, and put it below Adagnister, actually. So, the problem with Marincess right now is that it's really good at playing a bunch of hand traps. Like, it can play... Honestly, it plays more hand traps than it does Marincess monsters half the time. But we're in a format where a bunch of hand traps isn't, like, the most optimal thing to go for. Also, its inboard just isn't too strong and is very susceptible to board breakers. Super Poly into Mud Dragon is just... It sucks, you know, it really does suck. It is really cool that it can make really big bodies and then make them unaffected with their Marincess Wave, or even using the field spell if they really feel like it. But it does have a lot of issues breaking boards, and if it can't break boards, it's going to really struggle in matchups like Sprite, because Sprite, even if it's just left with one level 2 monster on their end board, you're not going to be in for a good time, because all it takes is one more for them to rebuild their entire board and potentially wipe all of yours. I think this will change a little bit for the better when we get World Ocean Dragon Zealantis in Darkwing Blast. I think it is really good for the deck because it gives it the ability to break boards like Access Code, despite being the one Cybers deck that actually can't play Access Code. I think the deck is fine, don't get me wrong, but it has been solved to a degree where people just know exactly what to do against it. We're seeing, like, very little representation compared to what it was doing, and while I do believe it did win a regional, I don't think it's, like, too crazy as a deck. And finally, to wrap up the tier list, we have Live Twin. This is going to be Live Twin and Live Twin with a small Sprite engine in it. I want to put it... I guess I'll put it above the Dino Morphia stuff in the Rogue category. I think it's pretty good. I like that you can use the very consistent Live Twin engine as a way to access your Sprite engine in case you need to, like, desperately get to your big bodies. However, board breakers are really rampant, and so your Trouble Sunny isn't going to be doing too much if it gets smacked by a Dark Ruler. And it's mainly just the consistency and the lack of hand trap fragility that is keeping it afloat. Again, this isn't going to be talking about the decks like the one that did receive a top cut slot in the European Championship, because again, that was actually Sprite using the Live Twin engine to access it rather than, you know, the Live Twin engine using the Sprite engine to access the Live Twin stuff. But I mean, hey, at least you got native access to Ultimate Slayer without having to, you know, side in the targets. Hey guys, so to top off the absolute mess that this video already is of me rambling, I actually completely forgot to put Earth Machine on here, and I know, despite my actual usual hatred towards it as a running joke on my channel, that wasn't intentional, so I guess I'll take this little clip here to realistically talk about Earth Machine. I think it's actually really great right now. I'd put it towards the top of the Rogue category, maybe even at the top. It's incredibly consistent. You have extra endboard pieces such as the Therian cards now that also let you protect your plays from things like Nibiru. Not to mention, we also have the Vernislift package and also the Earth Channeler that came out of Power of the Elements. So you basically just get free extension and starting there. Just keep in mind to be careful with both of those packages when you're using your Dark Machina monsters. But yeah, I think the deck is overall just in a better spot now than it ever has been, and it's honestly a really good time to play the deck as well, because Regulus has gone down a lot in price. It also just has really good going second and board breaking potential, especially when it comes to OTKing, and so honestly, I'd overall say this deck is a very solid strategy to pick up this format. But yeah, again, I am really sorry about that. It wasn't intentional, so I hope you guys enjoyed me actually talking about Earth Machine for once instead of just putting it at the bottom of the tier list. So now, let's go back to past me ranting like a loser. But yeah, guys, that is going to be doing it for my tier list. Sorry that it was all rambly. I'm like so tired right now. I've been talking for like almost a whole hour non-stop. But yeah, I feel like this is a relatively accurate tier list, especially once I did explain it a bit more in the beginning, so it actually put me in the right mind for it again. While there are a few undisputed top decks, I do think there are a lot of other decks that keep them in check that you could see a lot of success with, which I think is what's so great about this format. Unfortunately, there are just a lot of really big power cards, like all the stuff that Flunder plays, and like things like Dimensional Barrier and everything, that keep it from being like super enjoyable, because there are a lot of sacky wins due to those cards. It's kind of like, hey, if you draw this card, you kind of just win. But I think those are like the only things that need to be addressed, and then we might need to see like some old stuff come back on the next list in order for the format to just be really fun. There's just so many different ways you can play Yu-Gi-Oh right now, which I just think is so cool. And while nothing too crazy is happening in this month, at least for Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of product-wise, I do think that we at least get a really cool format. Remember that these are just my thoughts. Let me know yours down in the comments below, because that is going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as that will put this video and the channel into YouTube recommended. And if you liked it and you want to see more content like this, like the rest of my tier list, I have a lot coming for September, so keep that in mind. Then perhaps consider subscribing, because we're on our way to 2,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. It supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. But, well, again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.